A. Picture this. You're sitting in a windowless room in Langley, or maybe a quiet, secure think tank in DC, flipping through a highly classified, heavily redacted foresight report. The title on the cover? The Morning After.
That sounds like the cold open to a geopolitical thriller. But honestly, it's exactly the kind of scenario planning happening right now behind closed doors. Everyone in the public sphere is so hyperfixated on the daily headlines, the immediate chaos, the current administration, but the real strategic minds, they are looking past the horizon. They are trying to map out the blast radius and the rebuilding phase of the post-Trump era.
Exactly. And that's what we are unpacking today. If we look at this through the lens of an intelligence report, stripping away the partisan emotion and just looking at cold, hard probabilities, what actually comes next? Because the Trump administration, regardless of how you feel about it, is a massive gravitational anomaly. It bends the trajectory of both major political parties, the media ecosystem, and global alliances. When that gravity is suddenly gone, the universe doesn't just go back to normal.
Not at all. It's like removing a massive concrete dam from a river. The water doesn't just politely return to its old predictable flow. You get flash floods, new channels carved violently into the earth, and some previously lush areas left completely dry. In intelligence terms, we are looking at a period of high velocity realignment. And the options for what that realignment looks like are fascinating and frankly, a little daunting.
Let's open the first file in this hypothetical intel brief. The most immediate question is what happens to the political base that was activated over these years. There's a prevailing assumption among some traditional establishment types that once the figurehead is gone, the movement simply evaporates. That feels incredibly naive to me.
It's the very definition of wishful thinking. The intelligence community would categorize that as a low probability, high risk cognitive bias. The underlying conditions that created the populist movement, industrial decline, deep distrust of institutions, cultural alienation, the feeling that the coastal elites have rigged the game, none of those are resolved. So the first highly plausible scenario is what analysts might call populism 2.
The software update.
Precisely. Imagine the populist operating system, but stripped of the chaotic, unpredictable bugs that characterize the original version. You get a successor who possesses the exact same ideological core America First, anti-globalist, highly skeptical of international alliances, but operates with ruthless, bureaucratic efficiency.
That's a fascinating pivot. Instead of governance by late-night social media posts and off-the-cuff rally speeches, it's governance by quiet, methodical policy dismantlement. It's the difference between a guy with a sledgehammer randomly knocking down walls and a structural engineer quietly removing the load-bearing pillars.
That's the perfect analogy. Populism 2 wouldn't need to be loud to be effective. It would focus heavily on institutional capture, placing deeply loyal personnel in the administrative state, reshaping the judiciary even further, and codifying the America First doctrine into permanent, unshakable law. For allies abroad, in Europe and Asia, this is actually the most terrifying scenario. A chaotic leader might accidentally leave diplomatic loopholes. A hyper-competent populist closes them permanently.
Which leads perfectly into the second scenario in our brief. Let's say the pendulum swings hard the other way, not just ideologically, but stylistically. I'm talking about the technocratic restoration, the absolute desperate craving for boring.
The return to normalcy and steroids, yes. If the electorate reaches a state of absolute physiological exhaustion with political theatre, the market demand shifts entirely to stability. In this scenario, you see the rise of hyper-competent, almost aggressively uncharismatic managers taking the reins.
I love that phrase, aggressively uncharismatic. It's like the political equivalent of plain oatmeal. You don't eat it for the culinary thrill. You eat it because your doctor told you your blood pressure is dangerously high and you need to survive.
Exactly. But here is where the intelligence analysis gets a bit dark. This technocratic return wouldn't just be a passive reset. It would be highly defensive, almost like an immune system overreacting to a virus. The establishment, having been deeply traumatized by the populist wave, would likely attempt to Trump-proof the system. We're talking about erecting massive legal and institutional guardrails, stripping executive power, heavily reinforcing civil service protections, maybe even restructuring how elections are certified and how media is regulated.
But wait, doesn't that inherently backfire? If you build a massive bureaucratic fortress around the establishment to keep the populace out, don't you just validate the exact populist argument that the system is rigged, elite-controlled, and utterly unresponsive to the working class?
You hit the nail on the head. That is the fatal flaw of the technocratic scenario. It's like putting a heavy iron lid on a boiling pot without bothering to turn down the heat on the stove. You might stop the splashing for a while, but eventually the pressure builds to a catastrophic explosion. You solve the short-term volatility, but you virtually guarantee a long-term systemic crisis.
So if the moderate technocratic lid eventually blows off, what about the left flank? There's a scenario here where the rubber band snaps completely in the opposite direction. A progressive resurgence that doesn't just want to restore the old order, but wants to fundamentally rewrite the American social contract.
The pendulum effect. In intelligence modeling, you often see that an extreme action in one direction guarantees a disproportionate extreme reaction in the other. If the populist era successfully dismantles legacy progressive policies, environmental regulations, civil rights frameworks, the traditional tax code, the backlash, won't be a gentle correction to the center. It will be revolutionary.
We'd be looking at a generational changing of the guard. The younger demographics, who have been politically activated by what they view as an existential threat to democracy and the climate, finally taking the absolute reins of power.
And their agenda wouldn't be incremental tinkering. We are talking about sweeping, aggressive structural changes. Expanding the Supreme Court, abolishing the legislative filibuster, aggressive wealth redistribution taxes, and a climate policy that resembles a World War II style economic mobilization. It would be progressive shock therapy.
But shock therapy usually causes severe convulsions. If you try to force a massive, rapid progressive overhaul on a country that is still deeply, fundamentally divided, you aren't creating unity. You are just flipping the monopoly board over. The other half of the country, the rural areas, the traditionalists, the corporate sector, isn't going to just sit quietly and accept a new, hyper-progressive reality.
They absolutely won't. And that's the massive risk of the rubber band snapping so hard, it hurts whoever it hits. The economic and social friction alone would be staggering. Markets despise uncertainty, and a radical progressive swing would introduce unprecedented regulatory and tax uncertainties. You'd see immense capital flight, massive corporate pushback, and potentially a total legislative gridlock as conservative states simply refuse to comply with federal mandates.
That refusal to comply brings us to the final and perhaps most alarming file in this intelligence brief. The fragmentation scenario, the multipolar America. What happens if the center simply cannot hold, and the federal government loses its monopoly on national direction?
This is the balkanization model. And honestly, we are already seeing the early warning signs flashing red. In this scenario, the post-Trump era isn't defined by who controls Washington, D.C., because Washington becomes increasingly paralyzed and irrelevant. Power devolves aggressively and messily to the state and local level.
So, massive states like California and Texas essentially stop acting like members of a union and start acting like sovereign nation states.
Exactly. Keep in mind, they already have the GDPs of major global powers. Imagine a near future where California signs its own independent climate and trade treaties with the European Union, while Texas creates its own parallel immigration enforcement apparatus and entirely deregulated financial markets. The federal government becomes a hollowed out shell, basically just funding the military and managing the currency, while actual domestic policy is entirely fractured.
It's the ultimate corporate breakup. America Incorporated splitting into competing regional monopolies. But the human cost of that is terrifying to consider. Your fundamental human rights, your economic mobility, your access to healthcare or reproductive rights, it all depends entirely on your zip code. It becomes a geographic lottery.
And a logistical nightmare. Imagine running a national supply chain or a tech company when environmental, data privacy, and labor laws change radically the moment a truck crosses the border from Nevada to California or from Oklahoma to Texas. It cripples national efficiency, but more profoundly, it shatters the shared American narrative. If we don't consume the same media, abide by the same fundamental laws, or share even a baseline vision of the future, are we actually one country anymore? Or just 50 states sitting in a trench coat pretending to be a unified republic?
That image is as darkly funny as it is deeply unsettling. Looking across all these scenarios, the refined and ruthless populist, the defensive technocrat, the progressive shock therapy, and the fractured, balkanized republic. It feels like the one missing option in this entire intelligence report is simply going back to the way things were.
Because that option doesn't exist. In intelligence analysis, the past is a reference point, never a destination. The Trump administration was an accelerant. It poured high-octane gasoline on structural fires that had been smoldering in the American foundation for decades. Wealth inequality, media fragmentation, the hollowed-out middle class from globalization. You can eventually put out the fire, but you cannot unburn the wood. The house has to be rebuilt, and the new architecture is going to look completely different from the old one.
It really forces you to step back and look at the grand, sweeping arc of history. We get so caught up in the daily outrage cycle, the latest poll numbers, the newest political scandal. But beneath all that surface noise, massive tectonic plates are shifting. The American experiment is undergoing a profound, irreversible mutation.
And mutations in any complex system are inherently unpredictable. Some lead to evolutionary leaps, creating stronger, more resilient, and more adaptable systems. Others lead to terminal systemic failure. The intelligence community can map the probabilities, they can highlight the threat matrices, but they cannot dictate the final outcome. The only absolute certainty in the post-Trump era is that the geopolitical and domestic shockwaves will outlive the administration itself by decades.
Which leaves us with a lingering, almost philosophical question to close on. When the dust finally settles, and the history books are written about this specific era a century from now, will we be remembered as the generation that let the Republic fracture under the crushing weight of our own divisions? Or will this intense, chaotic pressure cooker be exactly what was required to forge a new, more durable American consensus? The intelligence report ends there, with a blank page. The rest, it seems, is entirely up to us.